I think we're very lucky to have Gary here with us. And sorry about that. And tonight we're going to do the second half of step 1 and step 2. So Gary, I don't want to cut into your time. Just, it's all yours.
Okay, and laying that out there puts a lot of pressure on me. I'll try to get through that. Hello, everybody. I'm an alcoholic. My name is Gary Kincaid. And I am really, 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 really grateful for a sobriety date and for a new life. It started July 25th of 1994. Started out in West Texas in Odessa. Today I live in a little town east of Dallas, Sulphur Springs. Our meetings have been opened up for about 3 months now. Most of the last 20 months I've enjoyed Big Book Solution Group on Zoom. We meet every night, 8 to 9:30 Central Time. It's been some of the best AA I've ever been a part of in my life, and I've made some real lifelong friends there. And more of them here, I hope. I'm going to tell a couple of stories as we move into the 2 steps, kind of outlining my experience in recovery. And I find mine is not all that unusual. I use an example of comics. I believe the comic, it's usually in the Sunday newspapers. And yes, I still receive newspapers. And I think it's called The Family Circus. And if you recall reading it, it's usually in just one frame. But every now and then they will have a repeat theme of where mom or dad will ask little Billy to go out and get the newspaper. And if you are having this in your mind's eye, it'll show him very excited to do it. He opens the front door, heads to the yard where the paper is, and then he gets distracted by some friends next door, and it shows him climbing over the fence. And then he gets distracted by a cat, and it shows him chasing the cat. And then he's walking down a street, and he finds a mud puddle, and he plays in it a while. And finally, at the very end of the cartoon, he comes through the gate, picks up the paper, very disheveled, walks in the house, and he's completed his task. Our line in the book, thoroughly following the path we took, I want to suggest to you that's what my path in recovery looks like. I would like to believe that I just walked this fine line right by the numbers on through this, but my path to recovery has looked more like little Billy going out to get the newspaper. And the more I get to know people in the program, that's kind of true of all of us. I've had 2 sponsors. I had Jerry for the first about 10 months, and then he moved. I was without a sponsor for maybe a month and a half, and I got my current sponsor on October 2nd of 1995. That happened to be his 6th AA birthday, and I've never let him forget since then that I'm probably the greatest gift he's ever received on one of his birthdays. And I've had Steve ever since then. Both of my sponsors have been, they taught me by their actions that AA is a real bad place to visit. It's a place I have to move in. I had some experience in 1988 in visiting AA and in making some meetings. It just didn't turn out very well. And for me, this has to become a way of living. And it's just a place I had to move in and sell out to. And Jerry was very good at taking me through the book and taking me through the steps so that I could experience a changed life. The first thing that Steve did is we went through the book and he showed me what had happened to me in that first year of sobriety as we went through the book. And so I try to do these step sharings out of the experience of those two men and how I followed them. And I also tell people I don't call this a study. I'm going to share my experience with the steps. Tonight I want to talk about, I always do this on the second night, about one of the most influential people in my life that I met in AA early on. Now, telling you a little bit about me, I grew up in Odessa. I went off to college. First person in my family, huge family, extended family, to ever graduate from college. Met a young woman my senior year, lovely, beautiful woman, very talented. Married her, and I believe, I'll always believe that I loved that woman. The very best I was capable of at that time. Was planning on going to law school. I am so grateful I did not do that. If I'd gone to law school, I'd probably be rotting in a federal prison somewhere today, as sorry as I turned out to be. But I ended up going to SMU for graduate school, to seminary. That delighted my wife and many people in the family, and I chased that. I got 2 graduate degrees, theology and psychology. I'm heading off to be a United Methodist pastor. Along the way, became a family therapist, joining that together. So when I read Bill's story, I can identify a little bit with waiting late in life to drink. I was 19 and in college because I'd made a promise to my folks that I wouldn't drink, to my mother. I can identify with Bill of having arrived. I didn't speak of it that way, but by golly, when I was going through it, I arrived, graduating, and then in that first profession, it seemed like the worse I got as an alcoholic, the more I got kicked into larger and larger congregations. It seemed like I'd arrived. That young lady and I had 2 children, twins, a son and a daughter. And I didn't know until I did inventory that I'd only had 2 goals in my life. One of them was to get out of Odessa. And that wasn't the town, it was the idea of get out into the world, and when I'm a man making my own decisions, everything's going to go wonderful. I'm going to do it a whole lot differently than the home I grew up in. And the other goal I had is I wanted to be a dad. I really looked forward to that. When I had children, we were going to be a happy home. A lot of laughter and fun and playing. There was going to be love and respect. There was never going to be arguments, and the police were never going to come up our driveway, and their mother would never have to put them in a car driving beer joint to go looking for me. We were going to have this wonderful, beautiful, loving home. And by the time I got to you, that was a long way in my rearview mirror. Part of my story is they kicked me out of that with good reason, though I held some resentments at the time. State of Texas did the same thing with my license as a therapist. At the time, I didn't like it, but I tell you, it's with good reason. Both of those outfits should have gotten rid of me a long time before that. But I tell you that part to tell you about a man who had a lot of influence on me with doing the work in AA. I've got all of these advanced degrees. I see myself as Well, in any job interview, when they said, "What's your greatest asset?" I went immediately to my intelligence. And don't tell me that we don't have about half the people on here tonight that did the same thing. If I'd known how many other alcoholics thought they were the smartest guy in the world, I might have picked something else. But I'm in here. I don't know if I'm looking for what you have. I know today I was running away from what had me. I find it on page 25 of our book. I've come to believe in the hopelessness and the futility of life as I've been living it. And I really didn't have a clue about all that, how that had happened. And that had begun to get off my mind the last couple of years, because I had never wanted to not drink until I was about 44 years old. And then when I started trying to not drink, and in my case, that wasn't forever, it was just to slow down or not drink on certain occasions, or not drink at work, or not drink during the day, I found out I'm a guy that can't not drink. And I'm trying to figure this out. And we had a guy in my home group, I always want to talk about James. James was in his 70s, maybe one of the physically ugliest people I've ever met. I tell people, James had all of his teeth and he could touch his nose to his chin. His big old cowboy wore this huge hat, and he'd get behind the podium when called up, and he'd say, "My name is James Ford, and I'm a crazy alcoholic. I can't read or write. I can't even spell my own name. But my sponsor gave me that big book on tape, and he let me take my fourth step on a tape recorder. And I haven't had a drink since April 26th of 1980. And I probably had to hear James say that a half a dozen times in my first 2 or 3 weeks. Until one night he said it, and I believe it changed my entire life. Because I had a thought, good God Almighty, at one time I could read and write and do academic research in 3 languages. But I can't not drink. Maybe I'm not going to learn recovery. Maybe this is not an assignment that I'm going to read and then answer questions and get some information, and with that information I can then find a way to either control and enjoy my drinking or not drink altogether. I will say I got to know James real well after that. Had the privilege 4 or 5 years later of picking him up and taking him to meetings and visiting with him and finding out, the lesson that James taught me. He couldn't read or write. He did have the book on tape, and he listened to it almost every day. And having it on tape, I found out later he did what my sponsor encouraged me to do. He just listened to the black part. He did very little trying to figure out what things meant and what the correct angle on it was and how this might be applied a different way. He just listened to it, and what it said to do, he did. And that old man lived a life that I can only hope that my path being little Billy going out seeking recovery, that my life might someday end up as joyful and as surrendered as his was. And along about that same time, now I've got a sponsor. We're meeting twice a week, and we're reading the book out loud together, and he's taking me through, and he's asking questions, and he's hitting me exactly where the doctor's opinion is hitting us. with the nature of this illness that we have. And what he's talking about mostly in the beginning is that first half of step one, that I'm powerless over alcohol. And Jerry didn't talk to me about what was going on when I came in. He took me back to when I first started drinking and the progression of the alcoholism. And he kept having me look at my own life experience with alcohol. And I'll forever be grateful. I'm going through another divorce. I had a bad habit of getting married before I got here on a fairly regular basis. Neither of those children, who were 19 at that time, I hated myself for the father I'd become. I had absolutely no money. The only vehicle I had was a drunk 12-year-old Ford Ranger. The transmission was going out of it, and it went out immediately in my first week. So here I am, 47 years old, with all this education, having to ask people to give me rides to meetings. And that embarrassed me. It's really one of the best things that ever happened to me. The guys that gave me those rides turned out to be some of the best friends I've ever had in my life. I had some legal problems. I found out you do not have to put the IRS on your amends list. They'll put you on theirs. I had not filed in the previous 8 years. And I was sick physically. And every time I would want to talk about those things to Jerry, he would say, no, we're not going to talk about it. We're going to talk about what's wrong with you. Well, I thought the divorce and the kids and the money and the legal stuff was what was wrong with me. And he told me, Gary, those are not problems. Those are consequences. In your entire life, you've always tried to fix the consequences. And you've never identified the problem which keeps spewing them out. And I don't know how your marriage is going to go. I don't know if your kids will ever love you again. I don't know if you'll ever have a good job again. I don't know if those legal problems are going to send you to jail or not. I don't know what the IRS is going to do. But I do know that if you will do what we do, you'll find a way to live where you will never, ever have to take another drink or do anything to change the way you feel from the neck up. And it's my experience that by doing those things, it's going to be like a rock thrown in a pond. And after the splash of sobriety, the ripples will go out and they'll touch those kids and they'll touch the finances and they'll touch all of that shame and guilt you have. They'll take care of every one of those consequences. But we ain't working on them. You better find out what's wrong with you before you start doing any more work. And what's wrong with me, he showed me, is I'm powerless over alcohol. Always was. I'm one of those that was right out of the chute. What I thought was a tremendous capacity to drink, turns out that was the allergy. And it had me in the very beginning. I cannot start drinking and be able to, with any kind of accuracy, tell you or anybody else when I'm going to stop once I start. And it was that way from the beginning. And see, what I thought was, since I didn't drink every day in the beginning, I couldn't have been an alcoholic. The children's mother, my first wife, did not know I drank until we'd been married for 3 years. At that time, I could plan events about every 6 weeks, 2 months, to have to go out of town somewhere. And I could just party and drink and chase women and raise hell and be okay with that and get back home. No harm, no foul. What I didn't realize, and I saw this, and some of you may find it out of your own experience, is that every 2 months became 6 weeks, and then 4 weeks, and then 3 weeks, and then 2 weeks. And by the time we had been married for 3 years, I knew that I wasn't going to be able to wait until those trips. I never saw that as the progression of the illness. I had to have a sponsor taking me through this book to see that. So I got it down pretty quickly that I've got a body that cannot safely drink alcohol. I believe I mentioned last week, he pointed out, and my second sponsor pointed out, step one does not mean that I can't drink. It means I'm going to drink. And that's where we get into what I call the second half of step one, the powerlessness. Somewhere about the time I recognized what James was saying about this is a illness that I'm not going to learn the recovery, I must experience it. And there's a huge difference between learning something and experiencing it. We had a meeting one day, probably about my second or third week, and the topic, this is the third edition, was page 449. It was on acceptance. And I'm trying to make sense. Now, I'm not talking in meetings then because I'm pretty afraid of what y'all would think if I said something. It amazes my friends to know there was ever a silent time in AA for me, but there was. And I hope to never forget, after that meeting, Jerry walked out with me. He kind of got me by the arm and he said, Gary, they're on page 449. You're on page 30. We won't get to 449 for a long, long time. Now, he knew exactly what he was doing because I couldn't wait to get home and look at page 30 and more about alcoholism. I will tell people we now have a fourth edition. That same story is on page 417, and I haven't gotten there yet. What Jerry was telling me, that if I'm going to accept something, I darn well better be accepting to my innermost self that I am an alcoholic. I'm like the man who's lost his legs, he's never going to grow new. And until I accepted that with all of its meaning, until I accepted that with what he talks about on, I believe it's on page 18, Bill begins to really talk about this as an illness. No, it's page 20. You may have already been asking yourself why all of us became so ill from drinking. Doubtless you're curious to discover how and why, in the face of expert opinions to the contrary, we've recovered from a hopeless state of mind and body. If you're an alcoholic who wants to get over it, well, by then I was, but they hit me with a question that I wasn't ready for if it hadn't been for someone like James Ford. If you're an alcoholic who wants to get over it, you may already be asking, what do I have to do? In my entire life, I wasn't asked that question about my drinking or my consequences. I was asking the question, why does it have to be this way? Why me? Why? And the big book doesn't answer that question. It answers what we have to do. And y'all begin to introduce me to that this is a recovery that I'm not going to learn. I did not learn my alcoholism. I experienced it. I took the drink and I experienced drink after drink, day after day, week after week, year after year. I did not learn. I didn't write about it. I didn't have discussions about it. I didn't have process groups. I didn't do anything. I experienced my descent into the pits of hell. I didn't learn it. And y'all began to show me and then later on teach me I'm not going to learn my way into the ascent back into the land of the living. It's going to come behind actions, and I will experience recovery. And then after the experience, guess what? I've learned something. But I always wanted to do it the other way around. It was people like James Ford, in my first sponsor, that showed me that wasn't going to be possible. So about the time you and I get down, the idea, okay, I've got the allergy. I've got it. I understand that. Bill begins to introduce what for me is the real insidious problem of alcoholism, and that's my life is unmanageable. And for me, that's not the divorces, the money, or all that stuff. It is that as I have experienced this progression into the depths of hell in my life, seeing my life become the only normal one, living in a way when I was in my 40s that would have made me sick to my stomach in my 20s, and that seems like I had not even noticed it as it was slipping away. That my trouble is not just what happens when I drink. My trouble is what happens when I'm not drinking. I don't have any way to get and stay comfortable in my own skin with all of these emotions and feelings about all of those consequences. And I can't stand sobriety. And I'm going to drink again if I don't have something, some other power other than alcohol to allow me to live somewhat, as Bill says in the forward to the tradition, somewhat happily and usefully whole in the face of life, because life's going to keep coming. So Jerry took me to this, and we went over it time after time. You know, I'm saying we probably spent an hour and a half on these observations. Would be academic and pointless if our friend never took the first drink. The allergy is not a problem. There's really nothing wrong with my brain or any other alcoholic's brain. We've got good brains. Yeah, it takes a while for them to get unpickled when we get here, but we've got good brains. It would not be a problem for me to have that allergy to alcohol if I never took the first drink, thereby setting the terrible cycle in motion. And he goes down on page 23 and talks about how we'll have various reasons and excuses, but even to us, after a while, these are not plausible. And then at the top of page 24, and because all Jerry was doing as we read the book was he was getting me not to look at the information on the page, but getting me to look at my own life and see if I could find this information on the page coming out of my own life experience. And you know what? I could. It says at a certain point in the drinking of every alcoholic, he passes into a state where the most powerful desire to stop drinking is of absolutely no avail. This tragic situation has already arrived in practically every case long before suspected. Now, I didn't know this, Max, when I got there, but Joe and Charlie had come to the suburban group of AA in 1989. And my sponsor was about 10 years sober then, and he had gone, and he used to tell me later that his life was totally transformed after that weekend. So he hit me with the information. You better pay attention to this book. But when they have those squiggly words in it, pay real close attention to those. And that squiggly writing is the fact that most alcoholics, for reasons yet obscure, have lost the power of choice in drink. Russell and I were casually talking a little bit about that before the meeting. I'm not one of those that will ever say, today I choose not to drink. I've lost the power of choice. I've read the book at least 2 or 3 times, and I never find where I get it back. What I share with my people today is quitting. Quitting drinking does not work. Quit quitting and start starting. I can't quit anything. I had to start taking actions on a daily basis that didn't seem like they made any sense. But because I had come to believe in what my sponsor and his whole lineage and his sponsor, I came to believe what they were saying because I saw their lives. I became willing to do what they were doing and what they were asking me to do, not because I believed it would work for me, but because I could see that something was working for them. And that gave me some hope. We're unable at certain times to bring into our consciousness with sufficient force the memory of the suffering and humiliation of even a week or a month ago. We are without defense against the first drink. So I'll finish up step 1 with this. I may have said this last week. What it says to me is that if I drink, I'm screwed. And if I don't drink, I'm screwed. Step 1 is a bad step. It tells me that here's my condition, and Gary, there's nothing you can do about it on your own. Now, he's going to take me on through Bill's meeting with Ebby, and I'd love to be able, I could spend 2 hours on that. And he's going to, I love the chapter, There Is a Solution. And all I'll tell you is that this is true for me. Again, Russell, I'm going to use our conversation when you talk about the desperation, like there's no other choice. Well, it says that on page 25. Almost none of us liked. I'm sure glad he made it that way, because when I first got here, it looked like everybody in the room was just so happy to be an alcoholic and to be in AA. They used to say, I'm a grateful alcoholic. Do you remember that when you were new and people would say that? And I would scream out, like hell you are. Now, I didn't say it out loud. I just screamed it out in my mind. But over time, I came to be grateful for it. But in that first paragraph of There Is a Solution, it says we've come to believe in the hopelessness and futility of life as we've been living it. There was nothing to do but pick up the simple kit of spiritual tools laid at our feet. And I'll forever be grateful that I had a sponsor who had read page 18 and knew about being properly armed with facts about himself, so he could introduce me to those tools, which are our steps and ways to get into them and to use. And what he told me is that if you don't do that, what's going to happen to you is what leads us into step 2. Have you looked at the title of chapter, More About Alcoholism? It says more about alcoholism. I didn't understand that till I've been here for a few years. I mean, my God, we've got the doctor's opinion, we've got Bill's story, we've got what's going on and there is a solution, he's going to say, but there's more. And this more is the part that probably kills people like you, Gary. And the more is you're nuts. I know the steps has came to, it's talking about coming to believe in the power greater than ourselves, but it says restore us to sanity, which implies I and probably you, when we get here, are nuts. We're crazy. We're insane. And then he gives us 3 examples of its alcoholic insanity. And he told me, you pay attention in your home group, and you're going to see, sadly, every one of these examples be proven, not because they're written in the book, but because you're going to see them happening to people that you know and care about. And that first example is of the person, the retired guy, who thinks after a period of time, he can safely drink. Well, all of you that have been in AA for a while have seen that example lived out tragically time over time with people you know and love. Sometimes it's 90 days, sometimes it's 3 years. I've seen it as high as 42 years. But that idea to come back in my mind, into my thinking, that, well, it's been a long time, I could probably start all over and now I can drink with impunity. For me to even fondle that idea is insanity. And that is what Bill is writing about in that chapter more about alcoholism, the thinking that precedes the first drink. And he knows something about it. Go back to Armistice Day of 1934, which we just had last week. Bill is out of Towns Hospital again. He's actually telling the guy on the streetcar with him that day about all of his trouble with alcohol, about how he, as Bill said, it can't drink. Then goes into the bar with the guy and orders a drink. And the guy said, what are you doing after what you told me? You must be crazy. And Bill said, I must be. But left to my own, I believe, because I can see it out of my own life experience, I'll go in my thinking to, well, it's been a while now, I can probably drink, and I see it happen all the time. And the next one's our friend Jim. I mean, Jim went through the ringer. Y'all read his story. He's been to the treatment center, they call it the asylum, several times. He's lost his business. He's about to lose his family. He can't stand himself. But he's pretty sure he's got it down this time. And then we remember his experiment of wanting to put the whiskey in the milk. That's pretty insane. But when they reviewed what had happened with Jim, Bill gives that powerful line. What Jim did was he failed to enlarge his spiritual life. I've seen that happen time after time in these runs. Go back to page 14 of Bill's story, the alcoholic who fails to enlarge and perfect his spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others. For me, when I read the story of Jim, it's talking about failing to enlarge his spiritual life. It doesn't mean that he might not have been praying or reading something, but he was not taking the message to others still suffering alcohol.
Gary, about 5 minutes.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm so glad Bill knew that out of his experience. We go back to the doctor's opinion when Bill got back from Akron. he's kind of lost without Dr. Bob, but he says even in his lowest moments that almost drove me back to drink, a trip to the hospital would save the day. And you and I better be glad that he did that, because when you read the doctor's opinion and we read about those two examples that Bill encountered in Towns Hospital, that's Hank Parkhurst and that's Fitzsimmons. And without those guys, we probably wouldn't have our big book. Bill, as badly as he was feeling, continued to enlarge his spiritual life by working with others. And then we have me in that third example, Fred. And his was, oh, it's not that bad. I think I've got it. Those are the insanities that will repeat themselves over and over. And we get to see them, have to see them in our groups. And that second step says, if you don't find some power greater than yourself, you're going to go nuts again. Now, I told Jerry, and this is my second step is pretty quick, Lily, out of my experience. Because when we got there, after the questions on page 44, and I answered yes to both of them, and then it says, you've got to, the dilemma is that we've got to find a power greater than ourselves. Where and how to find it, that's what this book is all about. And I told Jerry at that time, I said, Jerry, we're going to have trouble with that. He said, why? And I said, I've been to seminary. I was a pastor for 14 years. I know everything there is to know about God. And he said, yeah, Gary, but you don't know God. He did not want any discussion. We had no writing to do about it. He asked me a simple question, and this is what I've been doing with men and women I've worked with ever since then. He said, do you accept that you are powerless over alcohol, that you're going to drink again? And I said, yes. And he said, do you believe that there's any power in the universe greater than you and greater than alcohol? And I said, well, sure. And he said, good, we're on step 3. No discussion, no writing, no talking, just looking at my own experience. Now, we read the chapter 2, We Agnostics, and I'll talk more about that in the 12th step. But it was just, as for me, steps 1 and 2 are pretty straightforward. Out of your own experience, can you see that you have the allergy? Can you see that you're going to drink again? You've proven that out of your own life. You're powerless. Are you, yes. Are you willing to believe that? It doesn't say came to believe in, it says came to believe that. And for me, that's a huge thing. And as soon as I voice the willingness to believe that, I'm so grateful for sponsorship that didn't leave me 3 or 4 weeks to think about that. He got me right into 60 to 63, and within a week, he had me on my knees. And we'll talk more about step 3 next week. Thank you.
Perfect, Gary.